The Ryan Jesperson Show, weekday mornings at 9 on 630 CHED.
How long? It feels like ages ago that we talked. It was probably like the beginning of March, so at least 2 months ago, we talked to Alberta Independent Senator Paula Simons as she was getting set to lead a panel of thoughtful Albertans from diverse backgrounds talking about Alberta's culture and how we define it. On that panel, Conservative MP Shannon Stubbs, former PC minister and MLA Doug Griffiths, journalist and good friend of this show, Omar Mualim, elder and academic Dr. Diana Steinhauer, and a political scientist out of the U of A, Dr. Jared Wesley. Thrilled to welcome three of those commentators to the program this morning. Senator Simons, we'll start with you. Welcome back to 630 CHED. Thanks for making time for us today.
Well, it's always a happy time to speak with you. And yeah, it was March 5th, I think, that I was out at the CHED studios. It seems like 1,000 years and a lifetime ago.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, and you were very kind enough to talk to me about the podcast in advance, the event. And so I'm really delighted that we're back on the show to talk a little bit about how it turned out.
I'm going to ask you a question here that has nothing to do with this event because just while I have you here, I'm curious. And we're noting that Peter MacKay has announced that Senator Denise Batters, your colleague in the Senate, is throwing her support behind him. And this on the heels of Senator Lynn Beyak throwing her support behind Aaron O'Toole, another leadership candidate. And it's prompted a question from a listener who says, this is Kim. She says, this may be a dumb question or not, but aren't senators supposed to be non-partisan? Now, you're an independent senator. You were, of course, appointed by a Liberal prime minister. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. How do you approach the partisan or nonpartisan nature of your job? I'm just curious, and Kim is too.
Well, I mean, it's important to understand that Denise Batters is a member of the Conservative Party of Canada. She's a Conservative senator, and the Conservatives in the Senate caucus with the MPs. They are absolutely part of the same party, and it is perfectly cricket for Denise to back a candidate and to do so publicly. I mean, that is what the Conservative senators. That's how they're set up. They're set up as part of the Conservative Party. I'm an independent senator. I'm a member of the Independent Senators Group, and we are in our group. Our strategy is to be nonpartisan. I am not a Liberal. I've never been a Liberal. I've never belonged to any political party, and I consider myself independent in that sense. So, I mean, the rules are different in our group than they are in the Conservative caucus. So, I mean, I certainly don't agree with my colleague Senator Batters about a lot of policy things, but I'll absolutely defend her right to endorse a Conservative leadership candidate because she's a member of the Conservative caucus.
Yeah. Perfect. Just was curious for your take on that. Let's welcome our other panelists here. Excited to have Doug Griffiths making his return to the show. It actually feels like it's been too long. It's nothing personal, Doug. Welcome back to 630 CHED.
I'm glad to be back, Brian. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Of course, everybody remembers your career in politics here and as a provincial minister and an MLA. And, of course, we'll have an opportunity to discuss your political career. Let's bring in our third panelist, Dr. Jared Wesley, political scientist at the University of Alberta. Doc, thanks for making time for us today. Happy Friday to you.
Morning. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Jared, as you approached this assignment, I know it was 2 months ago now, but you guys had a chance to put a podcast out and certainly get conversation going around Alberta's culture and how we define it. What would be the starting point? What would be the bedrock of where your perspective begins here?
Well, our research team has been looking at conservatism as the core of Alberta political culture because that's what we're known for. We're known as Canada's most conservative province. Some people call us the Texas of the North and so on. And our research team was out in search of ways to actually measure that. We have surveys that show, for example, that Albertans aren't nearly as conservative as that image portrays. So we thought we'd take a different tack, and we decided to convene focus groups across the province. And it happened, as we say, late in the before times. Back in November and December of last year, we got a good snapshot of what Albertans think the average Albertan is, and that's what our measure of political culture is. What do Albertans think the average Albertan feels about things like a sales tax or feels about things like a carbon tax and so on? And from that, we can actually get a sense of what they think are acceptable ways to think and behave within that political culture.
Doug, what do you make of this? It's you always see Alberta and Jared. I mean, hit so many nails on the head right there. You oftentimes hear us referred to as the Texas of the North. I've seen people tweeting about that just this morning. But what was your experience in government, and then of course now with your new role as CEO of 13 Ways? I mean, you consult with communities. It's your job to dial into identities and effective messaging.
Yeah, I mean, we do branding with communities and really emphasize don't try and be everything, try and be something very specific and be very unique, and that becomes your brand. I mean, your brand is not the logo and the emblem and a nice catchphrase. It's the culture that you portray, but you also create at the same time in your community, and you can apply the same sort of thinking and identify the same sorts of challenges in communities all across North America. There are a lot of places that are still saying they're one thing, even though they've evolved to something else. And you know, we honestly, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that we find we do something, it leads to success, and then we don't look back and evaluate if it's still leading to success. We get stuck, and it's great when we're successful, but when we're not, and we don't look back and reevaluate who we are, what we're trying to become as a community or as a province or as a country or as a business or as a person, then we wind up sabotaging our own success.
Senator Simons, you know, when we talk about Alberta's identity, and we'll circle back to this as well with Professor Wesley, but it's kind of funny. I was trying to explain to friends of mine in Vancouver. We were talking about this over online poker just last weekend. They said, explain to me how the entire province basically, I mean, not exactly, but their perception was the entire province outside of Edmonton votes Conservative. Not exactly, but for all intents and purposes, in the provincial election, they say Edmonton is this island of orange. They only send one Conservative MLA to the legislature out of all the ridings in Edmonton. And then just a few months later, the entire city of Edmonton sends but one right? The MP roster out of Edmonton to Ottawa in October was all Conservatives except for one, Heather McPherson of the NDP. And so they're sitting there. My friends in Vancouver say, help me understand Alberta. Help us understand how a city like Edmonton sends almost all NDP to the legislature and almost all Conservatives to Ottawa. How do you make sense of that identity?
Well, I mean, that is the great puzzle, and I'm still puzzling about some of those federal election results too. I mean, every election is regional, and every election is very particular to the candidates and the issues of the moment. And I think a lot of what happened in the last federal election is a lot of concern that Albertans felt that the federal government was not listening to the economic concerns of Albertans in the wake of the energy sector crisis, which of course has only been exacerbated by COVID-19. But this was one of the reasons that I wanted to convene this panel and to produce this podcast, Alberta Unbound. I mean, the genesis of it is that I went for coffee at the Little Brick with Dr. Wesley, and he told me about his research, and I thought, oh my gosh, the part of me that used to be a journalist and used to be a radio producer said, that's the genesis of a great panel discussion. So I put together a panel, and I wanted it to be really representative, to have somebody, like Shannon Stubbs, who is, a conservative federal MP, someone like Omar Mualim, whose background and politics are very different than Shannon's. And I wanted to have this really kind of thorough excavation of what makes us tick. And more than that, what are the myths that we're stuck with, either because we buy into them ourselves or because of the frustration we feel when people outside the province put us all in one box. And I was really delighted that we got to have a very thorough discussion about, are we as conservative as all that? And what do we mean when we say conservative? Are we fiscal conservative or are we social conservative? Those are very different things.
We're talking about Alberta's culture, Alberta's identity. This on the heels of Alberta Unbound, a panel discussion hosted by Senator Paula Simons. Doug Griffiths was there, former PC minister and MLA, and Dr. Jared Wesley, a political scientist at the U of A. Professor, I'm excited for this to tee up our second half of this conversation. When we talk about Alberta's identity and the research you've done around that, can you take us into this? I mean, I'm sure that you've determined some pretty fascinating things here.
Yeah, as I said just before the break, we've been touring around the province over the last number of months before COVID stepped in the way. We'd managed to hold focus groups with over 400 Albertans in 8 communities across the province. And again, we were aiming to try to figure out who do Albertans think the average Albertan is, not using surveys to figure out who, through statistics, is the average, what's the average rating on a left-right scale and so on, but who do Albertans think is the quintessential Albertan? And the easiest way for me to explain it is for your viewers just to go along with me and do the thought exercise themselves. So the first exercise we do is we ask people to draw me an Albertan. Right? Ryan, are you following along with me?
Yeah. There's a listener spelling out there. It's almost like they forecasted what you were going to ask them because they're describing the stereotypical Albertan right now in our text line. But you take us into this.
Yeah.
One, then I'll read it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we weren't surprised to see what we found. Most people, when they think of an Albertan, regardless of whether it's a woman drawing, a person of color drawing, an older person, a younger person, rural, urban, they draw somebody who is either a cowboy or somebody who's in the oil and gas sector, somebody who's a farmer. They're almost exclusively men. They're almost exclusively pictured with some kind of truck and bumper stickers on some of the trucks that we saw as well. And this person is normally in their 30s, early 40s. So that's what Albertans think the average Albertan is. And then our exercises from there ask them, well, we asked them actually to name the Albertan, and we got some interesting names, Joe and Bob and Dougie and so on. And then we asked
Martha and Henry.
And, well, exactly. And it does follow up on that image that Premier Kenney and before him Premier Klein had defined as the severely normal Albertan, right? And then our research asks, well, what does Dougie think and do when it comes to things like, as I said before, the provincial sales tax? Or what does Dougie think and do when it comes to vaccination or stay-at-home orders during the COVID pandemic? And from that, we can kind of get a lens into what Albertans think the average Albertan will let them do. What are the bounds of acceptability when it comes to behavior and thought? And we found some fascinating things.
Okay, well, this gives us a perfect launch pad for part 2 of this conversation. That's Dr. Jared Wesley. You're hearing a political scientist. Doug Griffiths joining us as well, former provincial minister, and Senator Paula Simons. Plus, on the text line, we'll take your comments, some of them somewhat self-deprecating, I think submitted in good humor. It's all part of the exercise. We're hanging out with Senator Paula Simons, political scientist out of the U of A, Dr. Jared Wesley, and Doug Griffiths, the CEO of 13 Ways. You can follow Doug on Twitter at Doug13Ways, Paula at Politics, and Dr. Jared Wesley at, how do you say it, Doc? Is it IPRA or IPR Academic? Is that how you say it?
IPRA Academic.
iPracademic. All right, good stuff. So you laid out your research for us. You gave us sort of what the stereotypical Albertan may look like. Let me read some of these, and these are not meant to offend. These are Albertans looking. Paula, you know I have to say that. These are Albertans looking inward. Okay. So from a 403 area code, listener says, it seems to me that Albertans are very traditional, stuck in the past, cannot move forward, only oil and gas, which is why conservatives are always voted in, and the same crap happens over and over. John from a 780 area code says, what's Alberta's culture? To me, it's a jacked up truck driven by a guy with a elementary school education, making $150,000 a year, wearing white sunglasses, a straight brimmed hat, and a full sleeve tattooed arm hanging outside the driver's window, rolling coal, says John. So, Senator, what are the implications of this?
Well, this is what I thought was so fascinating about Jared's research, is that what he found is that that's what we imagine Albertans look like. But I remember, there was this moment in the podcast where he says, I asked people, people of color, people who are women, draw an Albertan, and that's the guy they drew, but that's not what we look like. That's not who we really are. And that's what I think is so important, because I think sometimes that's the messaging we get about ourselves from social media, from mainstream media. And when we look at the national media, that's often the story that the national media tells about Alberta. But it's not true. And deep down, we know it's not true. But somehow we feel like we have to conform to that, even though we might know hundreds and thousands of Albertans who are nothing like that stereotype.
Okay, but Doug, we have pretty prominent representatives of our province that tap into that identity for their support, right? And that perpetuate that notion. I mean, Alberta's premier goes on the national stage and says we got to get her done. I mean, what are people supposed to think? I mean, is it Alberta's job to try to change these attitudes or perceptions?
Yeah, well, and I think it's very concerning. I was a junior high teacher. If you tell a kid over and over again they're an idiot, they start to act like an idiot. If you tell them they're going to be useless, they start to act useless. So the story we tell ourselves, we start to become it, whether it's true or not. And Albertans had this reputation of that. It was the same image. I mean, it's that same, cowboy kind of image. But it used to be the cowboy that was environmentally conscious and worried about animals and innovative and creative and pragmatic. Those are all the good elements you see. But we're creating this impression with our own mythos that we're only about oil and gas, that we're angry, that we're anti-science, that we're anti-environmental, and it's tone deaf. And I worry that if we keep telling ourselves that story, it's not just that we start to act more that way, it's that the rest of the world sees us that way. And that's not what Albertans are. We are that positive side of that strong character that cares about the environment and finds creative solutions to problems. And I mean, cooperatives were born in Alberta on the prairies. But we've told us this myth that we don't work together, we're independent, we don't need anybody else. And we've let our anger dictate who we are. And I mean, I always say your anger is a liar. It does not make you better. It picks an enemy and then you embarrass yourself with your rage. And that's what Albertans, I worry, are doing now. And we need to change that story and talk about all those good aspects and become solution seekers instead of finger pointers.
So through the course of all this, Professor, I mean, you touched on, you threw words in there that are like fire starters on talk radio when you invoke a carbon tax or a sales tax. But what are the implications here when we talk about Alberta's culture, Alberta's identity? People will say, for example, political leaders would say, if we ever were to even consider the idea of a sales tax here, we'd put it to a referendum. We would ask the citizens of Alberta. Is that what we're talking about?
Right. So this is where comparing political culture, which is that group mentality, to public opinion is so fascinating, because if you look at reliable surveys about the sales tax in particular, Albertans are actually open to having the conversation. But when we meet with them in focus groups, we ask them about it, and they say, well, Doug, you would never go for that, so it's not even worth starting the conversation. And just to build on what Doug had just said, not Dougie, but Doug, Doug was mentioning the stories that we tell ourselves are quite powerful. They put boundaries on what we think it's acceptable to talk about, acceptable to propose during an election campaign, and so on. So these are myths that we tell ourselves, but they're very, very powerful in terms of shaping politics in this province.
Our text line's really interesting right now. I wish I could make it public, but I can read some of these. But a listener says, I live in a small oil field town. The Alberta stereotypes are absolutely true. Another listener says, but the thing about those a-holes is that they aren't ashamed by people's description of them. They're proud to be the mascots of this province. Big L says Albertans are Republicans' little cousins, plain and simple. And Matthew says, don't you dare suggest that Albertans don't believe in science. But Matthew is texting in from a 306 area code, so he might just be trying to start a fight from Saskatchewan. Senator, I wonder if some of the people listening in right now may be perceiving this as an attack, as turning our barrels toward the firing squad type idea. Like, why are we attacking Alberta's strong Western, rancher oil field mentality?
There's nothing wrong with being proud of the history of this province or the industries that have made Alberta prosperous. And there's nothing wrong with being proud of being an Albertan. The reason I set out to do this project was to interrogate the degree of, self-defeating anger and why it is that, we perpetually feel so hard done by and perpetually feel so misunderstood, and why we don't celebrate the real diversity of this province. Because we are ranchers oil field workers. We are also research scientists and symphonic musicians and AI experts and people who create fabulous video games. And we are, dancers and actors and writers and doctors and nurses and lawyers. And we are all these things. And we can celebrate the real diversity of this place without constantly reverting to these old tropes that bind us. And that's why I called it Alberta Unbound. I mean, it's a play on the song Alberta Bound, but I'm tired of us being tied down by these myths and these stereotypes and these narratives of victimization. Canada doesn't need us to sulk. Canada needs us to step up and lead and to play all the strengths that Doug was talking about that have made Alberta great. I mean, and right now we need to draw on those strengths more than ever. This province is facing cataclysm, not just from COVID-19, but from the collapse in oil prices, and we're not going to get out of that by fighting amongst ourselves. We're going to get out of that by pulling together. That's the Alberta way.
Jeff Notchtagal is listening in. He tweets at me. He says, I'm loving these Alberta culture descriptions. He says, none of them, however, have yet described me. But then again, I've only been here 27 years, so I'm not quite a true Albertan, says Jeff Notchtagal. Jared, you hear that oftentimes, don't you? I get it all the time, quite frankly. I'm born in the Holy Cross Hospital in Calgary, born and raised Alberta boy, and I get it still all the time. I mean, if I dare flirt with the idea of a sales tax in Alberta or forward-thinking climate policy, there's a segment, a very loud and vociferous segment of our listening audience that declares it's time I move to Vancouver.
Well, that's the flip side of the severely normal Albertan mythology, right? Is that if you don't believe the way that Dougie believes, then you're seen as an outcast or an outlier or being un-Albertan. I would point this out, though, when we talk to Albertans about what Dougie thinks and does, it was interesting. He wasn't thoroughly conservative. So he was conservative in the ways that we think in terms of promoting the old prosperity doctrine, that if you work hard, you're well-deserving, you'll get your just desserts. And the flip side of that is if you're not working hard or you're poorer, on the poorer end of the scale, then you're the opposite of that, right? We also found that there was a penchant for civil society. People like community groups and volunteerism and a little bit of entrepreneurialism. But we found that Dougie was not nostalgic. Dougie was not anti-science. Dougie was not Alberta first. Dougie, if anything, was a Canadian patriot. So this idea that there is this monolithic fiscal moral conservatism that makes up Dougie's, the mythology of Dougie is just not accurate. There's parts of conservatism that play, but not all.
Friends, I want to read some content here submitted by our listeners. I'll just get you to respond here. Listener says, when it comes to Alberta's identity, conservatives all the way. We are taxed too much already. This is not even the time to talk about a sales tax. Oil and gas is what this province was built on. Get on our side or take a hike. Colette says, if the professor wants to do away with the cowboy image, he may have to approach Calgary, Ponoka, and other communities to get rid of their pro-rodeos. Rick says, I'm really tired of people thinking we can't be ourselves in this politically correct world. We are constantly badgered by the mindset of the people from Toronto and Vancouver, where everybody is loving and hugging and doing all this crazy crap. That from Rick. That's my favorite one. And this from a 403 area code listener says, I was born and raised in Alberta, and now more than ever, I don't feel like I belong here. Doug, that's the one that troubles me.
Yeah, I know. I have to admit, sometimes I feel that way too. I don't understand the anger and the frustration. But this isn't new. When I was in MLA, people would say, because I honestly have to admit, I was the first politician to ever say maybe we need a sales tax because without oil and gas revenue, we have a $10 billion shortfall. Everybody would say, well, then cut spending. But they always wanted other people's programs cut. And I'd say, okay, well, what are we going to do? Because cutting $10 billion will devastate our economy. And they'd say, I don't know. Don't cut my services, cut somebody else's. Don't raise taxes. But I should save oil and gas. Yet, I used to tell people, I'm a politician, not God. I mean, you're asking for a miracle. We need to have a real conversation about what the future of this province is going to be. And I think the root of this is not about the cowboy icon of the image. I mean, the cowboy icon of 30 years ago was that rugged, environmental, conscientious person. The challenge we have, I think, and it's not just in Alberta, it's across North America, it's a battle between those that want a revolution and those that want a renaissance. A revolution is about taking back something that you feel was stolen from you and going back to something that you had. And a renaissance is about moving forward and evolving and capturing new ideas and embracing new opportunities. And I really think that's the mindset battle that we have. People who think, oh, something was taken from Alberta and we need to get it back. And those that say, you know what, it's just a new challenge. Let's find a way to evolve like we have for our entire history. Well, every challenge creates new opportunities. And if you don't see the opportunities, you only see something taken from you, then you're going to get left behind.
I want to note, Professor, that people can check out your research if they want to learn more about it at commongroundpolitics.ca. As part of this conversation, obviously the panel that Senator Simons assembled represents people with a diverse perspective, diverse backgrounds. When it came to conversation around Alberta's identity, even considering all the research you did, was there something that surprised you? Was there a recurring theme that you noted?
I was surprised. I'll give you one example. We were at MacEwan University downtown here in Edmonton, and we went into a political science class. And we asked them to do that drawing exercise, draw me an Albertan. And two young women drew basically the same character we've been talking about all along here, a cowboy, right? And I asked them both, why did you draw that? And both of them said, well, I drew it because it's my dad. And I said, well, that's interesting. Did you think to draw your mom? And one of them said, no, you asked me to draw an Albertan. I said, is your mother from Alberta? She's like, oh, yeah, I'm born and raised like 3 or 4 generations back, but Albertan is a masculine concept, right? Huh. And I was just blown away at how how universal that image was. And it's not just within Alberta. If we do this exercise in Toronto, we ask them to draw an Albertan, they'd be drawing the same thing. And that's how powerful this myth is.
And it was really interesting because in the course of our panel discussion, it was not really something that I thought we would delve into, but we ended up sort of going off on I don't want to call it a tangent because that implies that it was a sort of a de minimis branch. But we had a really interesting discussion within the panel about toxic masculinity and to what extent all of the tropes of toxic masculinity sort of have an impact on the way we see ourselves as Albertans. That wasn't something I was expecting to come out of our conversation. It wasn't a question I specifically asked, but it was a really interesting thing that evolved as people around the table got talking.
Senator, throughout this exercise, I mean, you're the one that kicked this off. You put it together. How would you say that this influenced your perspective moving forward as you represent Albertans in the Canadian Senate?
It made me really keenly aware that it's not just my job to be the voice of Alberta, which sounds very big and pompous. It's my job to make sure that Albertan voices get heard. And what's really sort of surprised and it's made me both happy and sad is that when I've had people outside of Alberta listen to this podcast and they said, oh, we had no idea that Albertans were so complex. We had no idea that these issues were playing out there. And I had a listener from Vancouver say to me, I haven't been, east of the Rockies in 35 years, but your conversation was like a microcosm of all the issues that we're wrestling with right now, whether we're talking about, the environment or toxic masculinity or how we compose our sense of identity and how we deal with sort of Trumpism as it leaks into Canada. And so I have been both enthusiastic about the response that we've had because people across Canada and around the world are listening to this podcast in numbers that I find quite gratifying, but also disappointed in the sense that, to me, how ingrained those stereotypes are outside of Alberta and how hard we have to work to tell ourselves and other people the real rich complexity and diversity of this province and its history.
I love it. I wish we had more time. We don't. Senator, if people want to track down the podcast, where can they find it?
We are on iTunes. And now I'm going to sound like an ad. We're on iTunes. We're on Spotify. We're on Stitcher. We're on Google Play and Podbean. And I think we're still hoping for Pandora and iHeartRadio. It takes a while for these various services
Okay.
Or you can find it on my Senate webpage or my Facebook page or my Twitter stream.
I love it. This is the webpage you just launched. It looks great, by the way. Senator, thank you so much. It's great to hear your voice. Professor Wesley, thanks for joining us. Great to have you here.
Take care, everybody.
Yeah, and Doug Griffiths, nice to have you back on the show, Doug. Thanks for your commentary. We appreciate it.
Anytime. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you. And
Chet
thank
Nation,
you so much
that's
to
it.
Doug and Jared and everyone who took part.
Absolutely. That's Senator Paula Simons, of course.
The Ryan Jesperson Show, weekday mornings at 9 on 630 CHED. 630 CHED. 630 CHED. 630 CHED.